It had always been my understanding that the movie No Country for Old Men was a pretty much perfect adaptation of the Cormac McCarthy novel. But then, not too long ago, I actually read the book and was surprised to see some key elements being significantly different. Now, of course, no adaptation is ever going to be 100% accurate, but we're talking about like major omissions here, about significant plot elements and backstories that were completely removed from the movie, despite really deepening my appreciation for the story when I encountered them in the book. And yet, the strangest thing is that even after learning all this, I still wouldn't change anything about the movie. In fact, the whole experience has quietly challenged my conception of what the relation between an adaptation and its source can look like. But first, let's talk about these differences. The first has to do with a character who is entirely absent in the movie, and that is the young hitchhiker who Llewelyn picks up and travels with for a while. This subplot begins after Llewelyn has called his wife Carla Jean to tell her he'll meet her at the motel in El Paso, which would be about 90 minutes into the movie, so pretty close to the end, which already gives you some idea as to why it was cut out. But anyways, he picks up this hitchhiking girl, mostly because he still has a long way to go and it would be easier with a second driver. The girl says she's 18, but Llewelyn calls bullshit as she clearly is no older than 15 or 16. They make a couple of stops to grab a bite and Llewelyn learns that the girl is running off to California to make a fresh start and to escape from what seems like a troubled past. Llewelyn, who has been on the run himself for some time now, sympathizes with her and wants to help her. He gives her some money and promises to drop her off at a bus stop once they reach El Paso. He does, however, give her a warning about her plans, one that gives us some insight into what also feels like a reflection on his own journey so far, and on how none of it panned out as simply as he maybe thought it would when he first found that bag of money. Your notions about starting over, or anybody's, you don't start over, that's what it's about, he says to her. Every step you take is forever, you can't make it go away, none of it. You think when you wake up in the morning, yesterday don't count, but yesterday is all that does count. What else is there? Your life is made out of the days it's made out of, nothing else. Just like the movie, the book then skips ahead pretty abruptly to Sheriff Bell arriving at the motel in the aftermath of the shooting. But what is revealed here is that the young hitchhiker was still with Llewelyn and that she has also died. It looks like the attackers grabbed her, forced Llewelyn to put down his gun, and then shot both anyways. The movie makes a little nod to this by having that short scene where Llewelyn arrives at the motel and flirts with this lady at the pool, who is later seen floating dead in the water. But what's so tragic about the way this plays out in the book is that it's not just that Llewelyn gets a young girl killed while trying to help her, that there's one more innocent life that is wasted because of his actions, but also that because they were both found dead in the same motel, it looks like Llewelyn was actually cheating on Carla Jean with her. And so in the end, it's not just that he's robbed of his life, but also of his reputation and of his good name in the memory of everyone he's left behind. Well, almost everyone. In one of his many reflective monologues, Sheriff Bell reveals that he actually believes Llewelyn to be innocent of adultery, and even tried to communicate that to Llewelyn's wife. I wanted to tell her that the way they had it in the papers wasn't right, about him and that girl. It turns out she was a runaway. 15 years old. I don't believe that he had anything to do with her, and I hate that she thought that, which you know she did. And the main reason he couldn't tell her this is because shortly after the incident, Carla Jean herself would be visited by Anton Chigurh, which pretty much plays out the same in the book and the movie, save for one little detail that I do want to mention briefly. It's just a small difference, one that doesn't really change the content of the scene, but that just takes a slightly different route to get to the same endpoint.
This is the best I can do. God.
So in the movie, Carla Jean refuses to call Chigurh's coin flip, and instead confronts his philosophy by arguing that his insistence on leaving his decisions to fate is but a pretense to avoid culpability.
The coin don't have no say. It's just you.
In the book, however, she does call it first, and it's only when she sees that she called it wrong and realizes Chigurh is about to kill her that she attacks his reasoning. Personally, I think I actually prefer the way it plays out in the movie, as the idea of Carla Jean forcing Chigurh to kill her of his own accord rather than because of the coin flip is a more powerful way to undermine his misguided philosophy. But I also appreciate how the book really doubles down on that feeling of fatalism and on how our agency in the present is curtailed by our past selves and by past circumstances that slowly render an open future into an increasingly narrow trajectory. Every moment in your life is a turning and every one a choosing, Chigurh says to Carla Jean in the book. Somewhere you made a choice, all followed to this. The accounting is scrupulous, the shape is drawn. No line can be erased. You can say that things could have turned out differently, that they could have been some other way. But what does that mean? They are not some other way. They are this way. From this point in the story, it's mostly about Sheriff Bell, which brings us to what is arguably the most significant difference between the book and the adaptation: Bell's backstory.
I was sheriff of this county when I was 25 years old.
In the movie, we meet Bell as a wary old man who's lamenting the current state of the world, and whose gaze is turned towards a kind of mythical past where the world was simpler and its lawmen were more straightforward and honorable.
You can't help but compare yourself against the old-timers. Can't help but wonder how they'd operated these times.
Though of course this nostalgia is later undermined by Alice, who points out that the world has always been cruel and complicated.
What you got ain't nothing new. This country's hard on people.
In essence, what we learn is that Bell is sort of a coward, someone who dreams of an easier time because he's reluctant to face the complexities and dangers of the one he's actually living in. And in the book, this is made even more explicit and expanded upon with a backstory that was completely absent in the movie. For you see, in the book it is established quite early that Bell was actually a decorated World War II veteran. But it isn't until close to the ending, when he has that same conversation with Alice that we also see in the movie, that we learn why exactly he received a commendation, how this changed him as a character, and therefore why this backstory was so important as the linchpin of his character. So, at some point during the war, Bell was holed up with his squad in a farmhouse that got destroyed in an enemy strike, leaving his men severely wounded and trapped beneath the rubble. Bell initially tried to fight off the German riflemen that were advancing towards him, and he even managed to pin them down for a bit. But as it got dark, Bell got scared and he fled the scene, leaving his men behind to die. He still got a medal for it, mostly because, as Bell believes, they had to make it look good, they had to make it look like losing that position counted for something, but this just made him feel all the more like a coward who didn't deserve what he received, not the reward and not to walk away with his life. After confessing this to Alice, Alice responds that it was clearly a hopeless situation from the start, that Bell would most certainly have been killed if he had stayed, and that maybe he shouldn't beat himself up about it so much. Which Bell acknowledges, though it still doesn't help him with letting it go. You go into battle, it's a blood oath to look after the men with you, and I don't know why I didn't, Bell explains. I wanted to. When you're called on like that, you have to make up your mind that you'll live with the consequences, but you don't know what the consequences will be. You end up laying a lot of things at your own door that you didn't plan on. If I was supposed to die over there doing what I'd give my word to do, then that's what I should have done. You can tell it any way you want, but that's the way it is. I should have done it, and I didn't. And some part of me has never quit wishing I could go back. And I can't. I didn't know you could steal your own life, and I didn't know that it would bring you no more benefit than about anything else you might steal. I think I done the best with it I knew how, but it still wasn't mine. It never has been. And I loved reading this backstory because it emphasizes so effectively and so tragically that Bell's perception of the world is in large part a projection of the way he's actually feeling about himself. That the loss of value, the absence of honor and so on were in reality coming from within, from his feeling that he himself was the one who failed to live up to the legacy of those who came before him. Which of course is also kind of a mistaken belief, a romanticization of the old-timers and of how their character was somehow more pure and more honest. Alice even briefly touches on this when he asks what Bell thinks his grandfather would have done if he was the one trapped in that farmhouse. He'd have sit there till hell froze over and then stayed a while on the ice, Belle responds. Do you think that makes him a better man than you? Yes sir, I do. I might could tell you some things about him that would change your mind. I knew him pretty good. Well sir, I doubt that you could, with all due respect. Besides which, I doubt that you would. I ain't, but then I might say that he lived in different times. Had Jack have been born 50 years later, he might have had a different view of things. Also notice how they are specifically speaking about Belle's grandfather here. And that's because, while in the movie Belle follows a seemingly unbroken line of lawmen,
Grandfather was a lawman. Father, too.
in the book, while his grandfather was also a sheriff and was the one who Belle served alongside with,
Me and him were sheriffs at the same time, him up in Plano and me out here. I think he's pretty proud of that. I know I was.
Belle's father actually wasn't a lawman. He was a horse trader. He was just an, by all accounts, ordinary citizen. Feeling a stronger kinship with his grandfather, Belle doesn't mention his dad all that much in the book. He does, however, share this memory about him, which gives us some insight into the man's character. My daddy always told me to just do the best you knew how and tell the truth. He said there was nothing to set a man's mind at ease like waking up in the morning and not having to decide who you were. And if you done something wrong, just stand up and say you done it and say you're sorry and get on with it. Don't haul stuff around with you. I guess all that sounds pretty simple today. Even to me. All the more reason to think about it. I think the truth is always simple. It has pretty much got to be. It needs to be simple enough for a child to understand, otherwise it would be too late. By the time you figured it out, it would be too late. And I think this also becomes more important in the end, as there Belle actually reflects on not having talked about his father much, and this not doing him justice. This is right before he talks about the 2 dreams he had about him, the descriptions of which are virtually identical in the book and the movie. In both of them, these dreams seem to provide Belle with some kind of reassurance that all is not lost. Especially in that second dream about his father passing him on horseback with a torch and disappearing into the distance.
He's fixing to make a fire somewhere out there in all that dark and all that cold. I knew that whenever I got there, he'd be there.
But in the book, this being Belle's old man feels like it has a slightly different implication because that man was not a sheriff or a lawman but just an ordinary citizen. One that Belle, as badly as he thinks of himself for saying it, kind of looked down on a little bit. As in the eyes of the world, his father didn't follow in the footsteps of the man who came before him and lived a seemingly unremarkable life. And yet, as we saw in that earlier quote, Belle's father was still a man of quiet integrity. It was just that the kind of honor he lived by was one that tends to be overlooked, as it does in Belle's mind for most of the story until he remembers that dream. Which here then reaffirms not just that there is a vague notion of hope in the distance, as it does in the movie, but also more specifically that there is a certain goodness in the world that often goes unacknowledged, a goodness that nevertheless carries us forward and which quietly holds the darkness at bay. McCarthy likes to equate this metaphorically to the carrying of fire. He does so in his novel The Road.
You're carrying the fire.
What fire?
Fire inside you.
And here in No Country for Old Men, this metaphor for human perseverance, goodness and hope also seems to be there in Belle's father.
When he rode past, I seen he was carrying fire in a horn, the way people used to do, and I could see the horn from the light inside of it, about the color of the moon.
Again, it's a pretty subtle difference. Almost all of these differences ultimately are when you really break them down into their meanings, which is to say that all of them, from the idea of Llewelyn being completely overwhelmed by forces beyond his control, Belle feeling disconnected from himself and the world he lives in, to the broader themes of fatalism, agency and morality. All of this is ultimately preserved in the adaptation. And that's the real reason why I said in the beginning that I wouldn't change anything about the movie. It's because it succeeds at capturing the book's essence while also translating it into what I consider to be an absolute masterpiece of cinema. And so while inserting all this extra material from the book into the movie would have technically made it more faithful, it would also certainly have been a diminishment of the cinematic experience in its own right. The hitchhiker would most certainly have grinded the pace to a halt at a pivotal moment of escalation, and Belle's backstory would also have demanded too much setup for its payoff at the end. And yet the funny thing is, I do feel its story is richer now that I do know these missing pieces. Even though they're not explicitly included, I like the way they now exist in my private headcanon while I'm watching the movie. And vice versa, I like how I can better visualize McCarthy's writing thanks to the beautiful cinematic poetry that the movie offers. It's like the original and adaptation are existing together in some kind of positive symbiosis, with both works enriching and deepening each other, which is a pretty rare experience, as I feel like when it comes to adaptations, we too often end up focusing on what is different, on what is made better or what came out worse, what got compromised, what got diminished, and so on. And while this isn't a bad thing in itself, sometimes that's just the way it is, what this specific experience has shown me is that it doesn't necessarily have to be, and that you actually can have an adaptation and an original that are different from each other, and not only have them be great in their own right, but also have them be even greater when taken together. So this video wasn't actually on my schedule, it was sort of born out of some leftover material from my last video about moral philosophies, for which I was reading a bunch of Cormac McCarthy novels, including No Country for Old Men. And so while I don't have anything to promote, I do want to take this opportunity to remind you that I also have a second channel now for movie reviews, smaller essays, and other stuff that doesn't quite fit on the main channel. Most recently I've been mapping out the best movies of the 2020s so far, and not just the most prestigious movies, but also the future cult classics, hidden gems, and blockbuster favorites, which has been a lot of fun, and it's been great to see so many people adding their own suggestions. I also want to thank my patrons for their continued support. I probably wouldn't still be doing this if it wasn't for all of you. And to offer something extra in return, joining my Patreon will now give you access to my exclusive film club, which is basically a monthly movie discussion. Past episodes have already covered The House That Jack Built, a movie that was just a bit too controversial for YouTube, James Gunn's Superman, Sinners, Warfare, Denis Villeneuve's Prisoners, and Nosferatu. And up next is a Quentin Tarantino movie that I actually haven't seen since its release 10 years ago. If you'd like to join or just support my work, you can find more information on my Patreon page. Thanks to everyone who's already subscribed, thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you again in the next one.